December 1941. German infantry presses onward through the snow just outside Moscow. Every movement is exhausting. The bitter cold bites through their uniforms. While the village ahead is engulfed in flames, no comfort awaits. Only more Soviet resistance. They are 15 kilometers from the Kremlin. 15 kilometers, or 9 miles. So close, near enough to be seen with binoculars on a clear day. But they are fated never to arrive. Supply lines have crumbled. Reinforcements will not arrive. And within mere days, a vast Soviet counter-offensive is poised to push them back hundreds of kilometers. Yet, this begs the question, what if these soldiers had support? What if every German aircraft engaged over Britain had been deployed here? What if every panzer division stationed in the North African desert were instead aiding this advance? What if Germany had concentrated its entire might, every resource, every soldier, on overwhelming the Soviet Union? Was victory for Nazi Germany possible? The answer uncovers a truth astonishing about the true nature of warfare, and it is likely not what you expect. Before we delve deeper, take a moment and form a hypothesis. Consider a war between Nazi Germany against the Soviet Union, a direct conflict. No Britain, no America, no other fronts. Who would be victorious? Retain that conclusion, as by the end of this examination, you may well reconsider your initial assessment. If you appreciate history that analyzes economics and power dynamics rather than just battles and generals, please subscribe. First, let's define the scenario. What remains unchanged? September 1939, Germany invades Poland. The conflict starts exactly as it did in history. June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa is launched. 3 million German soldiers surge into Soviet territory, marking the largest invasion in all of human history. Adolf Hitler remains in command. The ideology and ambitions are unchanged, and identical genocidal goals. What is altered? Summer 1940. The Battle of Britain never occurs. The Luftwaffe avoids the loss of nearly 1,900 aircraft and 2,700 veteran airmen over England. By February 1941, Erwin Rommel is never dispatched to North Africa. The Afrika Korps, with its elite panzer divisions, instead remains in Europe. Come December 11, 1941, Hitler never declares war on the United States. Germany refrains from adding the world's largest industrial power to its roster of adversaries. No Western Front, no Mediterranean theater, no conflict in the Atlantic Wall, and no strategic bombing of German cities. Germany's entire might is now directed east. This is Hitler's ideal scenario. A singular war front against Bolshevism. No diversions, only absolute focus. The question is straightforward. Would it succeed? Let's analyze the numbers, starting with foregoing the Battle of Britain. Between July and October of 1940, the Luftwaffe committed all its assets against England. Its objective was to neutralize the Royal Air Force and prepare for an invasion. It did not succeed. The final count, 1,887 German aircraft, were either destroyed or damaged. This included 873 fighters and 1,014 bombers. But the truly devastating loss was this. 2,698 flight crew members were killed. These were not novices. They were seasoned pilots with combat experience in Poland and France, utterly irreplaceable. Now, imagine if none of that occurred. Envision all those aircraft and all of those pilots being available for the Eastern Front in June of 1941. Next, by skipping North Africa. The Afrika Korps began as a small contingent. In February 1941, the 5th Light Division arrived in Libya. By April 1941, the 15th Panzer Division had joined them. Then, in August, the 5th Light Division was reorganized into the 21st Panzer Division. Subsequently, the 90th Light Infantry Division entered the conflict. By 1942, this force comprised approximately 3 to 4 elite German mechanized divisions, supplemented by Italian units fighting in the desert. These were some of Germany's most capable troops, highly experienced and led by Rommel, one of the Wehrmacht's premier commanders, fighting in a desert 2,000 kilometers from where the decisive part of the war was being fought. The logistical challenges alone were staggering. German vessels traversed the Mediterranean in convoys, transporting fuel and munitions to Tripoli, from where trucks would then haul that fuel across hundreds of kilometers of desert to the front lines. All these resources could have been redirected to the Eastern Front. Finally, by not fighting the United States. No war declaration means no American bombers flying over Germany, at least not initially. The Luftwaffe would not need to withdraw its fighters to defend German cities. The anti-aircraft artillery would not be required to protect Berlin and Hamburg. It could be deployed to the front. The U-boat campaign would not be draining critical resources in the Atlantic. Those crews and submarines could have been allocated to other theaters. Construction of the Atlantic Wall would not happen. No concrete fortifications would line the French coast. Those engineers and that concrete could be used for fortifying positions within Russia. The calculation is clear. When combined, Germany gains an estimated 20 to 30% increase in effective combat power for Operation Barbarossa. This translates to approximately 1,900 additional aircraft for air support and ground attack. It means 3 to 4 elite mechanized divisions freed from North Africa, plus thousands of tons of fuel and ammunition no longer wasted traversing the Mediterranean. With such advantages, the invasion of the Soviet Union unfolds quite differently. But to what extent? Consider Moscow in December 1941. In our established history, German forces reached the periphery of Moscow. Certain units advanced to within 15 kilometers, and soldiers reported that they could glimpse the Kremlin through their binoculars. Yet they advanced no further, any closer. The Red Army had counterattacked, and German supply lines were now stretched to their breaking point. The troops were exhausted and freezing as the Soviet winter had arrived in force. The offensive ground to a halt and was then pushed back. Yet, it is crucial to note this battle was decided by the narrowest of margins. German commanders made desperate pleas for reinforcements, stating they needed just a few more divisions and a modest increase in air support. In this alternate scenario, they have it. Those extra divisions from North Africa, along with the Luftwaffe squadrons that historically battled over Britain, are now redeployed outside Moscow in December 1941. With 20 to 30% greater combat power, Germany's advance does not stall. They break through, and Moscow falls. Consider Leningrad in early 1942. In our timeline, the city endured an 872-day siege. The city was isolated, starved, subjected to bombardment, yet it never surrendered. This siege extended from September 1941 to January 1944. But in this alternate scenario, Germany has the forces that were historically engaged in Britain and Africa. A concentrated assault in early 1942, with fresh divisions, achieves a breakthrough. Leningrad falls. The Caucasus, summer of 1942. This brings us to the true objective: Baku and its vast oil fields of Azerbaijan. During 1941, Baku alone produced 23.5 million tons of crude oil. Throughout the war, the region supplied 75 million tons to the Soviet war machine. This accounted for roughly 70 to 75% of all Soviet oil and around 80% of its gasoline. Furthermore, approximately 90% of its motor oils originated from the Caucasus, primarily from Baku. Losing Baku means the Red Army grinds to a halt. Soviet tanks would run dry. The Soviet aircraft become immobile. The strategic importance of this was immense. During the Battle of Stalingrad alone, the Red Army consumed approximately 149,000 tons of fuel, a significant portion of which originated from Baku. In stark contrast, German forces commenced that engagement with a fuel deficit and lacked any substantial reserves. In this timeline, Germany's 1942 offensive, known as Case Blue, was directed squarely at the Caucasus. It came perilously close, as German forces reached the outskirts of Grozny, but they never captured Baku. The reason was a shortage of troops, as resources were stretched thin. North Africa was diverting divisions, while the Luftwaffe was occupied defending Germany from British bombers. In our alternate scenario, none of these competing demands exist. In the summer of 1942, with its full might focused on the Caucasus, Germany successfully seizes the oil fields. Let's consider the broader strategic map. By late 1942 in this timeline, Moscow has fallen and Stalin's government has relocated east, perhaps to Sverdlovsk or beyond the Urals, and Leningrad has been captured. The entire northern front is secure, and the Caucasus is in German hands. 23.5 million tons of oil per year now fuel Wehrmacht tanks instead of Soviet armor. Germany now controls everything west of the Urals. It appears to be a total victory. But then, a critical factor becomes apparent, one that Germany's generals had not fully grasped when planning Operation Barbarossa. Here is the element Germany failed to anticipate: the relocation of the factories. Between July and November 1941, as German forces advanced, the Soviet Union undertook one of the most formidable logistical feats in history. A total of 1,523 factories, entire industrial complexes, were dismantled, loaded onto railway cars, and transported eastward to the Ural Mountains. Workers and machinery went with them. All told, more than 10 million people were evacuated east in conjunction with those industrial plants. Workers, engineers, and all of their families. Entire cities were effectively uprooted and replanted beyond the Ural range. They re-established these factories in locations like Sverdlovsk, Chelyabinsk, and Nizhny Tagil, towns most Germans had never heard of, and cities located safely beyond the reach of the Luftwaffe. By 1943, these relocated factories were operating at full capacity, and their output was astounding. Consider the production figures for Soviet tanks. Soviet tank output in 1942 was 24,500. German tank production for the same year reached 9,300. This was a near threefold advantage. The Soviets were simply outproducing Germany by a margin of almost 3-1. Soviet aircraft production for 1942 was 25,400 aircraft. Meanwhile, German aircraft production in that year reached only 15,400 aircraft. Despite commanding all of Europe's resources, Germany was being outproduced, and this disparity was growing. Consider the problem of space. The distance from Moscow to the Urals is 1,400 kilometers. German logistics were already failing near Moscow. Their supply routes were stretched across ruined Soviet infrastructure. Soviet railways used a different gauge than German ones, and the roads turned to quagmires in the spring and autumn. Even with Moscow taken and the Caucasus region secured, the war would not be over. Soviet industry continues, and its armies would regroup east of the Volga. The Red Army could trade territory for time, drawing German forces further into a seemingly endless land. Germany could establish a new defensive line at Moscow and the Caucasus, but pushing eastward is impossible. The distances are too vast. The logistical equation does not work. By late 1942, Germany holds territory. It now governs the most populous regions of the Soviet Union. However, it has not won the war. This compels us to pose a new question. Could the Soviet Union, even with its industry beyond the Urals, actually force Germany back? Because a critical element has not yet been discussed. Something which, in our own timeline, was entirely decisive. On December 11th of 1941, a mere 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler declared war upon the United States. It was one of the most calamitous strategic decisions of the entire conflict. Germany had just added a power with 10 times its own industrial capacity to its list of foes. But in our alternate scenario, that does not take place. There is no declaration of war, no American entry into the European theater, and critically, no American Lend-Lease aid for the Soviet Union. Let us consider what that truly means. The answer is trucks. This is the decisive factor, the one element that is frequently overlooked. During the war, the United States sent 427,284 trucks to the Soviet Union. Consider that. Consider that figure. Over 400,000 trucks. Its importance becomes clear when recalling the Soviet Union's capacity to build tanks. The industrial complexes beyond the Urals were manufacturing 34s by the thousand. However, Soviet truck manufacturing was severely limited, insufficient for even fundamental logistics. The arrival of American trucks fundamentally altered this equation. Vehicles from Studebaker and Dodge and GMC, all robust, dependable, and engineered for warfare. By 1944, approximately 70% of the Red Army's motor pool was foreign supplied, primarily from America. Soviet troops nicknamed the Studebaker Studa and applied it universally, even using it as the designated mobile platform for Katyusha rocket artillery. These iconic Soviet rocket systems, particularly during 1944 and 1945, were mounted on American-built chassis. These vehicles transported Soviet munitions to the front, they facilitated troop movements, transported vital supplies, and ultimately enabled the Red Army to launch and sustain offensives over immense territories. Lacking these vehicles, Soviet logistics would have collapsed. The Red Army could produce any number of tanks from its Ural factories, but would be unable to deploy them to the front lines. Munitions would languish in depots 1,000 kilometers from the conflict, and troops could not be reinforced. Any offensive would stall. Then came the aircraft, 14,000 shipped from America and Britain to the USSR. And while Soviet aircraft production was indeed impressive, its quality was inconsistent, and the Soviets faced challenges producing certain aircraft types to manufacture. American fighter planes addressed this deficiency. The Bell P-39 Airacobra emerged as one of the war's most effective Soviet fighters. This aircraft was favored by Soviet aces. Aid also included American bombers and reconnaissance planes, all operated by Soviet airmen, and all contributing directly to Soviet air superiority. Without these American aircraft, the Luftwaffe would have held air superiority longer. Soviet offensives would have suffered devastating aerial attacks. Food was another critical component, 4.5 million tons of it. Soviet agriculture was ravaged by the German invasion. Ukraine, the USSR's primary agricultural region, was under enemy occupation. Collective farms were annihilated, and grain output plummeted, making American food vital to sustain Soviet troops. Without this sustenance, Red Army soldiers would have faced malnutrition. Combat effectiveness would plummet as frontline units starved, and morale disintegrated. The list included 1,911 locomotives and 11,000 railcars. This aid included machine tools, industrial equipment, and raw materials. These were not armaments. They were, in fact, the means to manufacture weapons for Soviet factories in the Urals. These supplies were essential for accelerating production. Without American industrial equipment, the Soviet war effort would slow. 34s would take longer to build, and output would drop. Consider the 2.6 million tons of petroleum products also shipped to the USSR. This brings us to a critical point. The question was never if Germany could defeat the USSR in a one-on-one fight. The real question is if the USSR could defeat Germany without the United States bolstering its logistics and industrial base. When viewed through this lens, the outcome becomes far less certain. In 1963, Marshal Georgy Zhukov was questioned about the Lend-Lease program. Zhukov was the Soviet Union's most decorated military commander, the very man who orchestrated the defense of Moscow, secured victory at Stalingrad, and led the final assault on Berlin. The KGB monitored the conversation, recording his exact words. He stated, and I quote, "People say that the Allies didn't help us, but it cannot be denied that the Americans sent us material without which we could not have formed our reserves or continued the war." Note that phrase, without which we could not have continued the war. This is the Soviet Union's most esteemed marshal, admitting that without American assistance, the USSR could not have kept fighting. Nikita Khrushchev would later echo this, stating, "In a one-on-one fight against Hitler's Germany, we would not have withstood its onslaught, and we would have lost the war. So, let us consider what probably happens in this alternate scenario." The timeline, December 1941, Germany captures Moscow, utilizing additional forces not diverted to Britain and Africa. Stalin's government evacuates eastward. By early 1942, Leningrad falls, which consolidates the Northern Front. By summer 1942, the Caucasus oil fields are secured. Germany now commands Baku's 23.5 million tons of annual oil production. By late 1942, German forces occupy all territory west of the Urals. The Soviet government operates in exile from beyond the Volga, while German defensive lines are established from Arkhangelsk in the north, running through Moscow and down to the Caucasus. Yet, Soviet production persists. Factories located in Sverdlovsk, Chelyabinsk, and Omsk continue to manufacture aircraft, and the Red Army fights on. consolidates its position. A fundamental dilemma now confronts both armies. Germany is unable to advance further eastward. The logistical challenges are insurmountable. Their supply lines are stretched to an unsustainable breaking point. The necessary infrastructure to sustain a further offensive simply does not exist beyond Moscow. Conversely, the Soviet Union cannot push west without American vehicles, crippling the Red Army's mobility. Lacking American food supplies, its soldiers face malnourishment. Without American high-octane fuel, its air capabilities are severely curtailed. The result is a stalemate. 1943 evolves into a brutal war of attrition, with German forces entrenching themselves. Soviet forces initiate localized counteroffensives that achieve only minimal gains for an immense price. Casualties escalate, yet neither adversary can secure a definitive breakthrough. This leads to two potential outcomes. Scenario 1, a negotiated peace. Spanning 1944 to 1945, both combatants are by then utterly exhausted. Stalin confronts a harsh economic reality. Soviet manufacturing is substantial, but without American logistics, the Red Army is incapable of utilizing its output effectively. Offensives falter. The Germans, despite being overextended, manage to maintain their defensive lines. After 3 years of savage conflict and no clear path to victory, Stalin concedes to a negotiated settlement. Germany maintains its grip on Western Soviet lands, Moscow stays under occupation, and the Caucasus oil fields remain in German control, creating a tenuous, bitter peace, one that would likely collapse within a decade as both powers rearm for a second conflict. Scenario 2 projects an eventual Soviet triumph between 1946 and 1947. The sheer scale of Soviet production, even deprived of American aid, proves overwhelming. By 1945 or 1946, the immense weight of Soviet industrial might starts to make a decisive impact. Germany, controlling hostile lands and facing partisan warfare that stretches across thousands of kilometers, begins to fracture. Soviet offensives, while incredibly costly and sluggish without American logistics, incrementally drive the German army backward. By 1947, or perhaps 1948, the Red Army finally retakes Moscow. The war concludes with a Soviet victory, but at a catastrophic cost, lasting 2 to 3 years longer than in our timeline. Millions of additional lives are lost on both sides, leaving the Soviet Union economically shattered. Europe is left in an even more ruinous state than what actually occurred. The fundamental truth is, this was never a conflict Germany could win on tactical merit alone. It was not a matter of operational genius, though both sides demonstrated an abundance. The war was not decided by it. It was not fundamentally about ideology, though that certainly drove the brutality. Nor was it merely about courage, though millions of soldiers on every side demonstrated incredible valor. This was, at its core, a war of industrial output, factories pitted against factories, resources against resources. The side capable of building more tanks, planes, trucks, and bullets would inevitably win. In our historical timeline, that side was the alliance of the Soviet Union and the United States. Remove the United States, and the entire calculation changes profoundly. The Soviet Union would still likely have won. Its industrial base beyond the Urals was immense. Its capacity to absorb casualties was unmatched. The territory it could sacrifice for time was nearly infinite. But victory would have taken years longer and cost millions more lives, with the outcome in late 1942 being far from guaranteed. What this reveals is that the Second World War was not won by generals, tactics, or competing ideologies. It was ultimately decided by economics. American trucks mobilized Soviet armies. American fuel powered Soviet aircraft. American food sustained Soviet soldiers. American industrial machinery built Soviet tanks. The Soviet Union undoubtedly bore the main combat burden. That is undeniable. Soviet soldiers fought and perished in numbers that truly stagger the imagination. Yet, American economic might made that Soviet victory possible, and it ensured that victory arrived in 1945 instead of 1947 or later. Production capacity matters more than tactical brilliance. Industrial power matters more than military doctrine. The nation that can outproduce its enemy wins. In 1941, that nation was the United States. So here is my question for you. If Nazi Germany had focused its entire war machine on the Soviet Union and the United States had not entered the war, could the USSR have prevailed without American Lend-Lease? Post your answer in the comments, because I assure you there will be profound disagreement. And that is where the most valuable discussions occur. This isn't just about the Second World War, this is about how conflicts are decided not by battlefield tactics, not by generals, but by economics and productive capacity. If this has changed how you perceive history, hit the like button, clears throat. Subscribe for more deep analyses into power, economics, and the fundamental systems that shape the world. Thanks for watching this analysis.